So yeah, I'm Steve. I work for Forestry England. The project is partnership led, as Keith's already mentioned. And I'm going to sort of try and quickly get through some of the background of the project as well. It might be quite useful for some of your newer members, but also a nice little refresher for those of you that perhaps saw Tim's presentation a couple of years ago. So, not quite working. There we are. So what is white-tailed eagle? Most of you, I'm sure, already know what white-tailed eagle is. But for those of you that don't, this is an adult bird, and I always think they look like they've gone to the hairdressers and got blonde hair highlights in their hair. You know, it's fantastic, quite pale blondie head and this magnificent white tail, and of course these gorgeous yellow eyes. But the juvenile birds look a little bit more drab, I suppose, and it takes about 5 to 6 years for them to look like that adult plumage. And yeah, this is kind of the bird that you'll see around Hampshire if you're lucky at the moment, and these are the birds that we release on the Isle of Wight, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So very briefly, a bit of a history of white-tailed eagles in the British Isles. So like a lot of birds of prey, white-tailed eagles were relentlessly persecuted really from the Middle Ages on, and you know, bounties were placed on these birds, and one thing British are pretty good at is wiping out species that we either don't understand or don't like or like to collect, and white-tailed eagles certainly suffered from this. And as Keith mentioned already, sort of more repeating what Keith said at the moment, I suppose, but what Keith's already said is that the last pair in southern England bred here on the Isle of Wight on Culver Cliff. And you can still go and see Culver Cliff if you come to the Isle of Wight, and you might be lucky enough to see white-tailed eagles fly over it now as well. And certainly in recent weeks, plenty of people have seen them in that part of the island. Again, Keith's already said the last pair was extinct on the Isle of Man in 1815, but the bird clung on in Scotland for quite some time after that, and it wasn't really until 1915, 1916 that these birds were wiped out. So the last bird was shot on Shetland in the early 20th century. But you know, these are some nice anecdotes about white-tailed eagles. How do we really know that these birds were widespread in the UK and British Isles in general? So we've got two nice maps here that kind of, you know, give the picture for me. I'm just looking for a laser pointer. I think we've got one. There we are. You see the map on the left. This is a map of place names that indicate white-tailed eagles might be nearby. So there aren't any places called Eagleville or Eagle City or anything like that, but there are a lot of places that use the old English name for eagle, being Erne. So the nearest to me, I suppose, is Arne down in Dorset, but there's also places like Ersley and so forth. So you can see from that map, you know, the white-tailed eagles appear to have been relatively widespread across England, Scotland, Wales, and into Ireland as well. But place names are kind of a little bit, you know, maybe they were there, maybe they weren't. But if you move on to the map on the right, you can see these are all the archaeological finds for white-tailed eagles. And again, you know, that distribution, certainly in England, is quite wide, really. So we can be pretty confident that these birds were present in England and well, across the UK in good numbers. So again, Keith's mentioned that these birds were reintroduced in Scotland, and this is quite a nice little timeline. I can't actually see all of it because my face is in the way of some of it. You've got a nice timeline here of the events in Scotland. So the first reintroduction efforts were in the 1950s, but the first serious effort, I suppose, was 1968, where Roy Dennis, who's pictured here below, was a caretaker of these birds on Fair Isle in 1968, and they released 4 birds into the wild there. And they were seen quite regularly over the first year, and a year or two later, no one really heard from them again. It was considered a bit of a failure at the time, but this first pioneering effort was really important in understanding how these birds behave and what's needed to care for them. And it wasn't until 1975 that anyone really thought about doing it again. And this was actually undertaken over 10 years, this project on the Isle of Rum. 92 juveniles released from Norway, and again, and then 1985, first successful breeding from this release on the Isle of Mull. And yeah, the population really slowly grew from this point forward. but it was felt necessary in the mid-90s to top up this population. So they released a further 56 birds near, I think it was Loch Maree, actually. Yeah, Loch Maree in West Scotland, using refined techniques. And this was really successful, and you start seeing the population really explode through the late 90s and 2000s. And it was so successful that there were 2 projects running in unison to try and make this bird much wider spread in the UK and Ireland as well. So 2007 to 2012, further 85 birds released in eastern Scotland and Fife. And in unison, there was a project in Ireland as well, releasing up to 100 birds. And then you fast forward on to well, modern times in 2018, 20 and beyond. There are more than 130 pairs in Scotland now. So I think that number's even going up closer to 150 now, which is a real success story, and you know, fantastic that this bird's really got a strong foothold back in the UK. So I mentioned the Irish project briefly, and yeah, again, this took place in Southwest Ireland between 2007 and 12, releasing 100 white-tailed eagle chicks, again using the same techniques that they developed in Scotland, and this has been really, really successful as well. And you can see the table. Oh, go back. Sorry, trying to get the laser pointer up again. And you can see the table here, which looks a little bit more complicated than perhaps it is. So the first release was in 2007, and actually by 2010 they already had a territorial pair. And then you fast forward to 2012, and they've got an active nest. And then a year after the final release, they actually get fledging. So in 2017, there were roughly 10 pairs, and I think this number is kind of about that right now. But from my understanding, they've had a few issues with some pairs coming to bird flu. So they're doing top-up releases now. So I think they're releasing 30 birds over 3 years. But all in all, it's a great success. So you know, we're very confident that this this model for reintroduction can take place here in southern England. If I fast forward to the next slide. But as I'm sure a lot of you will remember, back in 2019, when the license was granted for release on the Isle of Wight of white-tailed eagles, there were a lot of concerns raised, in particular from the farming community, but not just from the farming community. There are plenty of other stakeholder groups that raise concerns. And it's really important to note that these concerns are something that have been raised before, and in particular in Ireland, which is quite a recent reintroduction project. The farming community particularly had real concerns given things they'd heard from Scotland, but to date there have been no cases of live lambs being taken, and you know, this is partly due to the biology of the bird, but also it's down to the project team there making a really strong effort to engage the farming community and engage all stakeholders really. And now we see farmers in Ireland working really quite closely with the project, and the vast majority of them are either neutral or in favour, and some even help monitor nests on their land. So it's a really positive story for everyone in Ireland, really. But that's a little bit of background, and I've gotten through that very quickly because I understand, having talked to Keith before, this afternoon's talk, that you guys have heard a lot of that before, and certainly there's a lot of really good resources online, and you can go on the Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation website and read the feasibility report as well if you want to learn more about these past projects. But why are we talking about reintroducing them to southern England? You know, this bird's well established in Scotland. It's got a population in Ireland as well. So it kind of sounds like things are going well. So why bother? Well, it's a good question. But when you look at this map here, it gives an indication of where, you know, these established populations are in the UK and in Ireland, but also in Europe. You see, you've got your populations in Scotland and Ireland, and the nearest European population is the Netherlands. And this is a rapidly expanding population, but it's still quite some distance away, really. And then you look at our closest neighbour, France, and there's a really tiny population in northeast France. And this area of northeast France has seen wintering white-tailed eagles since the 1960s. And the bird actually went extinct in France in the early 1950s, the last pair being on Corsica, which isn't really very close to northeast France, to be honest. But they didn't get their first pair arrive in that part of France until 2011. So you think that's a good 50 years before they even consider being breeding in that part of the country. And we don't even see white-tailed eagles as a regular winter visitor to southern England, to be honest. I mean, we get the odd one turn up, but generally we don't see them regularly. So just the whole biology of this bird means it would take a long time for them to establish in southern England. They're very site faithful, and they tend to return to where they perceive to be home. And then you sort of look at white-tailed eagle conservation from a European perspective, and actually by joining up a population on the Isle of Wight, and funnily enough, I received an email the other day from a colleague in France who was really delighted to hear that white-tailed eagles had been reintroduced to the Isle of Wight, because he felt strongly that it was going to accelerate progress in northern France as well. So it does have significance from a European perspective as well. If I move on to the next slide. So that's southern England. Yeah, we want to re-establish this bird and link those populations already existing in Europe and British Isles. But why the Isle of Wight? You guys must be thinking, why not Hampshire? Surely, but anecdotally speaking, we know that it's the last breeding site in England was, last breeding site in southern England was on the Isle of Wight. But the Isle of Wight is a really important position on the south coast, and it's been important throughout history. And it really will help facilitate dispersal of these birds across all of southern England. You've got great breeding and wintering habitat in Poole Harbour, Chichester Harbour, the New Forest, Blashford Lakes, but even beyond to Pagham Harbour, and go further more into Devon, you see some really good areas for white-tailed eagles. So the Isle of Wight is a nice little almost stepping stone to the rest of England. But the Isle of Wight and the Solent itself also represent fantastic habitat for these birds. And when you look at southern England, it's really not too dissimilar to the nearby Netherlands. So it kind of suggests that white-tailed eagles should do really well here. And I've mentioned the Netherlands a couple of times, and I think it's quite important that we talk about the Netherlands, because this is probably, the Netherlands is the most densely populated country in Europe, and it's really very similar to southern England in so many ways, not just socioeconomic reasons, but its ecology as well. And you look at the Netherlands, and it's got the same assemblage of wintering birds that we have, and it's got breeding terns, Mediterranean gulls and black-headed gulls, and all these birds live alongside white-tailed eagles. And actually, in this photo is a really good example of how well these birds can exist in quite densely populated areas. I mean, you look at this, and all right, it's not Southampton Water or Portsmouth Harbour, but it could be. This is actually just outside Rotterdam, and you've got this big barge out here, and you've got these nice little inlets and islands around. And actually up here, just under this laser pointer, is a white-tailed eagle nest. And I should add that this photo is taken from the side of a motorway. So this is a really busy place, but white-tailed eagles are thriving here. And if this isn't enough evidence to suggest that white-tailed eagles can do well in urban settings, look up white-tailed eagles in Helsinki, because there's a pair that are right on the outside edge of Helsinki, and it's a fantastic series of photos you can see there in Finland. And you think, well, okay, yeah, we've got all these fantastic birds that we have, but are they causing problems for those birds? These are birds that we consider of conservation importance, and Solent and the Isle of Wight and the waters around the south coast and the coastline there is a critical position for these birds. But actually, when you look at the diet of these birds, most frequent things that occur in their diet are grey-lag goose and coot. And I can tell you from experience as well that these birds, usually when they're taken, they're birds that are injured or sick, or they're inexperienced birds. They're not birds that are healthy. So they perform quite an important role really in the ecosystem in removing these unfit individuals. But really, these birds want fish, and I should say that these stats that are quoted on the slide there are probably a little bit unfair to fish in a way, in that fish remains don't really turn up very well in pellets, and you have to be pretty patient to watch these birds catch fish, if I'm honest, as well. So fish is probably under recorded in these birds' diet, and really it is what is, you know, what they want to get if they can get it, and it's just that water birds are more available across more parts of the year in the Netherlands. But really, the other important aspect is that we don't see any conflict with livestock farming in the Netherlands at all, and it is an area it's got lots of livestock farming as well, and we don't see this anywhere else in Europe. And if you go to Denmark, where again the population has expanded really rapidly, there's something like 110, 120 pairs in Denmark now, and they're a big producer of meats, and they don't even think that conflict could be anything to talk about. And you talk to colleagues in northeast France, and you say, "Oh, is there any conflict at all?" And they say, "Oh, fishermen don't really mind them because they eat cormorants," and they don't even think that livestock might be a problem. So this discussion about sheep and livestock really is unique to Scotland in terms of white-tailed eagles. So I'll move on now to what we're doing now. And this is probably the bit that most of you have been keen to see, and I'm doing all right for time, so we got plenty of time to talk about the reintroduction to date. So I think the first thing that's to talk about is really the process of translocation. So some of you will be aware that you know, these sorts of projects need licenses. Others maybe this is something new to you, but the project received license from Natural England to release these birds into the wild, and also a license from Scottish Natural Heritage to collect chicks from wild nests. So we go and collect birds at roughly 10 weeks old, and there's a condition of a license that says we must only collect from nests of 2 or more. So these birds usually have 1 or 2 chicks, sometimes they'll have 3, but we must always leave one behind so that we don't impact the donor population. So you know, once you remove the oldest chick, the youngest chick will suddenly thrive because it's getting all the food, and the birds adapt very quickly to this, and it's really good for that individual that's left behind, the weaker bird. So we bring them to the Isle of Wight, we reel them in special pens in a confidential location, and then we tag them prior to release with a GPS transmitter, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And we continue to provide food throughout the year at the release site, and at other locations as well. So should they come short of food, they can come and find it prior to independence. And the license allows us to release up to 60 birds over a 5-year period. So we've got capacity for about 12 birds. So yeah, we're a little bit behind on 60, but who knows, we might be able to catch up a bit later on. So, you know, talk about collecting chicks, and you know, I really don't have a head for heights at all. These birds tend to nest in trees across a lot of their range, and they tend to nest in pretty big trees most of the time, although occasionally they will nest in small scrubby trees and even on the ground in some parts of their range. And this brave soul Fraser is climbing up this tree a mole, and you know, you might even think it's worth it when you get to the top. Get this fantastic view, and you can see 2 young white-tailed eagles, and these are only a few days apart in age. And this bird on the left is G393, who we'll talk about again in a little bit. And this bird has been to Hampshire recently, actually. And so he was collected, and his sibling was left behind, and is doing really well in Scotland, from what I understand. But not all nests are on trees. Some of them are on cliff faces. And these birds, this bird in the foreground was collected this year, and you think, oh, that looks like quite a nice view, but then you go to a nest on the Isle of Harris and Lewis, and what a view that is, you know. And think, oh, that looks all right, Steve. I don't know what you're worried about heights, but you know, this is what you have to do. You have to abseil down a cliff with an eagle strapped to your belt, and well, I don't really have quite the bravery for that myself. It's just a good thing that the guys that climb have no regard for their personal safety, as far as I'm concerned. And then they checked in Scotland, made sure they're fit to come down, and they make their first flight to the Isle of Wight in a little Cessna. So they meet us on the island, and it's kind of a surreal experience collecting white-tailed eagle chicks from a plane on a small airfield. You know, you kind of get the impression that the police are going to turn up and think you're smuggling drugs or something like that, because it's just very, very strange. And I should add that the pilot of this plane and his daughter, you know, without their help in 2020, we wouldn't have been able to bring chicks to the Isle of Wight at all because of COVID restrictions. You know, nobody could share a vehicle from different households, so we couldn't have driven them down from Scotland. It really was thanks to those guys' generosity and time that we were able to proceed as well as we did. So, and they arrive and they get, you know, almost like palatial treatment, to be honest. They you know, this fantastic paintwork of their rooms, and they get this lovingly made nest out of grass and moss, and these perches to play on, and they get a fantastic view of the Solent as well, I might add. And they really are very fortunate to spend their time with me, and they get all kinds of delicious food for the 4 to 6 weeks that they're with us in the pens. I'm sorry for you, those of you that had your lunch already, and hopefully this doesn't make you too hungry. But a lot of the food we get is from local crab fisheries. So it's all bycatch from crab pots, so stuff that they would use for bait, or it would just be cast overboard. So it's really good to make use of this stuff that's you know, really a waste product in a lot of respects, unfortunately. So they get these fantastic fish called ballan wrasse and cuckoo wrasse, but their favorite meal really is conger eel, and conger eel heads are kind of like big ice cream cones to white-tailed eagle chicks. You know, like they just, I don't know why they like them so much, but you know, they just can't get enough of them. And you get some really big conger eels. You can get some, and some of their heads like weigh a kilogram. So it's quite some impressive feat for them to drag them around and tear them up the way they do. But I should also add that we try and supplement their diet a little bit, so we give them rabbit and pigeon as well occasionally. And actually the first year's birds, I think they got scallops quite a lot as well, which was, you know, I was quite jealous of that, if I'm honest. I don't eat a lot of fish, but those scallops only just gone to them because they were out of date by a day or something. So and then the great thing really, and probably the most important thing, is that these birds are totally undisturbed whilst we hold them in the pens. You know, they don't see us at any point. We feed them through these little hatches in the sort of rear of the pens, and then we're able to monitor them using a really incredible CCTV system. And some of you, I'm sure, would have seen some of the images on the Twitter feeds and perhaps on the TV shows as well. And you know, it really allows us to get a really good understanding of how these birds are doing, and make sure they're developing properly. And then when they're fully grown and fully developed at about, you know, 12 to 14 weeks old, they're really ready to go. And we hold them a little bit longer just to make sure that when they do take their first flight, they are really ready, and they don't ditch in the sea or ditch in a bush somewhere. But an important part of the project is to ensure that the birds are tracked and we understand how they're behaving. So they're all fitted with these GPS transmitters, and they're all GSM transmitters, and they're, you know, smaller than a mobile phone. You know, to give you a sense of scale, it's probably like half the size of my mobile phone. They only weigh 50 grams. And then we add this VHF radio transmitter as well, so that if for whatever reason the GPS tag breaks down, we can try and track the bird down using more traditional telemetry techniques. And these transmitters are really incredible and really powerful. And because they're linked to the mobile phone network, I can actually send an eagle a text message to change its transmission cycle or update the amount of data that we're collecting from these birds. And we can even set up things called geofences, so I can draw a little square on a map and say, you know, if it enters that square, I want more data, or I want less data, or whatever. We can do an enormous amount with these tags, and the data we collect is absolutely incredible. And to give you a sense of the scale of it, you know, 3 of the birds from the 2019 release have given us over 60,000 points each since being released. So I mean, that's an incredible volume of data, and sometimes it's almost a bit too much, really, to be perfectly honest. But you know, once they're tagged, off they go. And really, I remember Roy and Tim saying to me, the easy bit was when those birds were in the pens and you know where they are and you can feed them, and if there's a problem, you can sort it out. And then once they go out, they're kind of on their own, and you just constantly worry. And I didn't really believe them at the time because I was tired and kind of stressed out. And now I realise a couple of years on that they were really quite right about the whole situation, and it's so much easier when you know where they are. But excuse me a minute. But that's that's the easy part of the process. The hard bit is trying to figure out what on earth is going on and how these birds are behaving in England. And really, that's in a lot of ways the most crucial aspect, is that we understand that these birds are doing well and that they fit into the landscape. So I'm sure a lot of you would have seen parts of this map already. And if you haven't seen some of these maps, you can find them on our social media, or you can find them on the Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation blog page. I can send Keith some links if you guys need them, and he can send them round. But I've very conveniently color-coded all 4 of the surviving birds from 2019. So for those of you that don't know, we had one bird die of natural causes shortly after release, and another bird went missing, and we honestly don't know where it is, but it's unfortunately likely died. So you've got 4 colors. So the first one we'll talk about is this orange one, which is the bird you saw in the nest, and that's G393. And he spent only a few weeks on the Isle of Wight before he decided he had enough and he was heading off. And he actually spent 2 or 3 days on the North Solent shore as well before heading up to Oxford and Buckinghamshire, where he spent nearly 7 months hanging around with red kites and buzzards, mostly surviving on carrion. And these first winter birds really do depend on carrion. And we think the reason he turned up in Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire was that there are just so many red kites, and it's quite easy for them to find food using those kites. And kites, as a lot of you will realise, are largely carrion eaters themselves. So, but one advantage that a white-tailed eagle has over red kites is that it's an awful lot bigger. So if they have something that they want, they're quite capable of pinching their lunch money, so to speak. So he spent a long time around there, and he actually spent a lot of time in this little valley on the Bucks border, and he was mostly eating rabbits and game birds, but also the occasional mallard and wood pigeon and black-headed gull. And then he kind of went on a bit of an adventure, headed round to Staffordshire, and then he went round to Rutland Water for a little bit, and he sort of did a little turn up to North Yorkshire, and North Yorkshire is where another one of these birds was hanging out too. And North York moors, for those of you that have never been, are absolutely covered in rabbits. There are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of rabbits up there, and that's what these birds were largely doing, eating rabbits. And when he finally got bored of that, he went off to Norfolk for a while, where we know he actually appeared at Wild Ken Hill, and he appeared at RSPB Schnessisham and on the Wash as well. And he was seen by lots of local birders. But perhaps the most important element of his diet whilst he was there were black-headed gulls. He really loved black-headed gulls. And we kind of thought he was really settled there until just after Christmas. In January this year, he kind of started making a move, and he actually drifted north initially, and that kind of surprised us. We thought, oh, maybe he's not going to come back to the Isle of Wight ever. Maybe he doesn't perceive the south coast to be home. And then suddenly he just kept heading south, and he actually went past his little his old haunts in Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire before coming back to the Isle of Wight. And I was lucky enough to see him on the Isle of Wight for a few days before he eventually left again. And he's still on the south coast, but he's not on the island anymore. And then I suppose the other bird, which also was in North Yorkshire, we could talk about G318, a big female. She spent her whole winter on the Isle of Wight, and she actually spent most of that time in a tiny 1 kilometre square. And there were quite a lot of days I kind of wondered whether she was all right or not. And we didn't get much data because she spent so much time just sitting in a tree in the shade, and these tags are all solar charged, so she didn't have much battery life, and it was a bit concerning at times. But then she was fine. She just knew what she was doing. She was just a very patient bird, and she made his journey north in March last year. headed up to North Yorkshire, and she spent pretty much all of the summer into September in North Yorkshire before returning south a little bit into Lincolnshire, where again she was eating rabbits and hares. And this bird is quite curious because she's probably the only one that hasn't spent lots of time at the coast. So she's kind of become a bit of a rabbit and hare specialist. And then as recently as 2 weeks ago, she headed south, and she actually came back to the island as well before heading off again. And she's still on the south coast, and that's a really important aspect of all these birds, is that they've returned to the south coast of England. And then I'm sure a lot of you would have heard about the dramatic journey of G324, who went up to Firth of Forth in Scotland, and if she'd gone a little bit further, she could have found other white-tailed eagles in eastern Scotland, and she may never have come back. She might have just decided to stay there. But fortunately for us in the project, and she came back south, and she's still on the Isle of Wight, as is G274, who's the bird in yellow. So G274 is the bird I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail, because he's probably the bird we know most about, because he's stayed on the south coast of England, and really for most of his life he stayed on the Isle of Wight. And I actually saw him this morning as well, which is always handy. So this is G274. A lot of photos by this chap Ainsley Bennett, a good friend, and he gets some really gorgeous photos. And this bird always seems to feature. I kind of joke that he's probably following him around somewhat. Oh, sorry. So this is G274's data since release. So this is all of his tracks throughout his life, which is really fascinating. You probably notice he has been over Hampshire a few times and over the New Forest a few times as well. He kind of likes little trips to Bewley Motor Museum every now and then, and if you're down the Bewley River, there's always a small chance you might see him fly over and back to the Isle of Wight. But the Isle of Wight he has covered pretty much in these yellow tracks. But really, I suppose a lot of you guys want to know is what has he been doing? And more specifically, I guess, is what do they eat? So I drew up this nice little pie chart for you guys to show sort of the proportions of sort of major animal groups that this bird eats. So you can see it's roughly fairly evenly split between birds, fish, and mammals, with birds and fish taking up majority, and also he eats the odd crab, and he also eats cuttlefish, as some of you will have heard, which are mollusks, although I guess you could group fish and mollusks and crustaceans into one sort of watery group. So fish is probably what these birds are best known for catching, and like, to be honest, in all aspects of their hunting, they adopt this very much sit and wait strategy. So you pick a prominent perch, and they just sit there and wait for stuff to happen. And actually, a lot of people got some really fantastic photos of him sat in some of the estuaries on the Isle of Wight on these old posts. And you could get remarkably close to these birds without disturbing them whilst you're on the water. Whereas, if you're on land and you walk up to them, you only have to be 100 meters away and they'll get spooked pretty quickly. But for whatever reason, he seems very tolerant of you if you're on the water. So he sits on these posts and he kind of just waits and waits for opportunities. So fish, you can see them swimming around the posts with him sometimes, which is, you must think he just can see this big dinner plate and wonder what's going on. But estuaries are one thing where they wait for a rising tide and they wait for the mullet to come in, and they're really, it's shallow water, it's easy for them to catch. But probably what's more impressive is that this bird has been off the southwest coast of the Isle of Wight, and he's even been out. This red line indicates he's been as far as nearly 5 kilometers offshore, and we know that he's been catching fish offshore, and that's that's a long way for one of these birds to fly. And when you're stood on the edge of the cliff watching these birds, he's a tiny little dot at that point. And fishermen have actually seen him swimming around their boats, and even taken some scraps off them as well. But this shoreline has this quite prominent ledge along it, and at certain tides, the bass and the mackerel push up the whitebait against the rocks, and they also surface as well, and you get this big feeding frenzy of gulls, and that's kind of what draws him in. And he's more than capable of spotting these fish from quite some distance away, and he'll go and grab them. And it's it's quite entertaining. You can see the fishing boat there, and this friend of mine watched that bird catching a small bass as he was sitting around waiting for his crab pots to be hauled up. And he actually feeds on them like a kind of like an oversized hobby on the wing, you know, like this, you get like fish scales falling down on you, like some kind of bizarre snow. It's just very odd. And you can see there's a few other images here that people have submitted to us. And you know, I think it's important to note that there's other ways to get fish other than just catching it yourself. And mugging your nearest neighbor for his meal is always a useful strategy. So ospreys in particular are very good fishermen, and they can mug ospreys, but they also pirate food off cormorants and herons as well. And they'll even utilize seals. You can see the seal in the corner here. They'll even utilize seals to catch fish. The seals, they dive down in the shallow waters in some of the estuaries, and it just pushes all the fish to the surface. And these birds have actually learned that that this is a really good strategy to sit on a nearby perch and wait for the fish to come to them, exerting absolutely no effort, which is really what these birds are about. And then even more miraculously is the capturing of cuttlefish, which are really fascinating creatures. I wish I could talk to you guys about cuttlefish for a little longer, but we're already running a bit low on time actually, so I'll move on a bit quicker. But cuttlefish is something we really didn't expect them to catch, if we're honest. And I can remember picking up lots of cuttlefish bones as a kid on the beach. And you know, it was only last year when this bird was catching cuttlefish that I suddenly remembered that cuttlefish existed again. A really fascinating thing to watch. But the biggest diversity of things that they eat, I suppose, is birds. And birds are, as we saw from the Netherlands, water birds are a really important part of these birds' diet. But they also take game birds mostly as carrion, and they'll take corvids, they'll take pigeons. Again, pigeons probably mostly as carrion. We see a lot of these birds feeding mostly on carrion during their first winter. And with a large number of game birds in the countryside, it's no surprise that they feature quite highly. But as I get a bit older, and you know, G274 in particular has become really very capable of catching a range of water birds. They can chase down gulls, you know, black-headed gulls, meg gulls, herring gulls. They chase them down in the air, and they pick out the weak birds. You can see them test flocks, and if there's a bird that's worth pursuing, they can really motor and knock them out of the sky. It's you know, it's quite terrifying to watch, actually, to be honest. And then coots, again, really important part of their diet, as we saw from the Netherlands. But also get as big as Canada geese and grey-lag geese. So you know, in Netherlands and Denmark and parts of Germany, these birds are quite important in controlling numbers of feral geese, really. And I expect they will start taking more goslings as they get older as well. And Canada goose goslings are quite an easy meal for a white-tailed eagle. And the last group of animals that features most prominently in their diet are mammals. And it has to be said, probably the principal item that's most important is rabbits. And I think rabbits are probably the easiest thing for these birds to catch as at the start of their sort of hunting prowess. You know, the rabbits aren't the sharpest tool in the box all the time, and this sit and wait strategy really works very well for them on short downlands where they can just sit in a tree and wait for rabbits to come out of warrens. And I've watched G274 sitting on fence posts above warrens, and then he just sort of jumps on rabbits. And it's you can see why they like these animals, and we find most of that in pellet remains as well. So very quickly, because I realise I'm running low on time, what about Hampshire? You know, you guys have heard a lot about the Isle of Wight. You've heard a lot about these eagles travelling all over the place, and you must be wondering, why aren't we seeing them more often? And are they even coming to see us? And well, a lot of you guys will know that you've had continental white-tailed eagles with you in Hampshire before, and this bird was photographed last winter just on the Wiltshire-Hampshire border, and this bird, we believe, came from as far away as Sweden. So it does indicate white-tailed eagles like Hampshire and they like the New Forest. And actually, we do see some of these eagles in Hampshire. And this snapshot is the snapshot Keith was talking about earlier, where you had 6 white-tailed eagles in Hampshire in one afternoon. And they just sort of seem to use it as kind of a highway to go through at the moment. I mean, they're from the Isle of Wight like me. I've spent a lot of time off the Isle of Wight as well. I'm not confined here, but when I go away, I don't tend to go to Hampshire. I tend to go a bit further away. It's almost like if you're going to leave the island, you might as well take the opportunity to go a bit further. And that certainly seems to be the case with white-tailed eagles at the moment. But I suspect in the next couple of years, when these birds start to establish territories, the older birds start to establish territories, those birds that are returning will be forced to look elsewhere. And I think that's when you'll start to see white-tailed eagles more regularly on the Hampshire coastline and near Hampshire, inland waters in Hampshire. And actually already we're starting to see territorial behaviour, particularly from G274, who pursued G393 from the 2019 cohort. He's pursued him off the island twice already, which is this first sign of territorial behaviour. And then G324 kind of joined in pursuing G318 away at the weekend too. So we're not seeing those other 2019 birds stay on the island very long. And we think that is very much due to these 2 birds almost perceiving the island to be their home and even perhaps starting to defend a breeding territory. Although it's a little early for them to be considering setting up nests, we could see something happen next year, which would be really exciting. So Keith knows about this map, and I think I alluded to him when I spoke to him last, that there might have been 6 birds in the county the other day too. And here we are, we had 6 birds. These are all in the morning of a morning this week, actually. I think it was Wednesday this week or Tuesday this week. You had 6 birds cross into Hampshire, but all of them left eventually, apart from G393, who spent the night up near Basingstoke. So I think I'm going to leave us just enough time for a few questions, but just very quickly, I'll just say there's lots of ways to get in touch with the project. So for those of you that don't know, HOS is actually represented on the steering group. So as part of the license, we have to have a steering group and a monitoring and evaluation group, and HOS is represented on both those. So your voices are heard in the project management, so to speak. But you can also get in touch with us when your sightings via Roy Dennis Wildlife submission form online. If you've got a photo, or if you've got general queries or any concerns, you can get in touch with me on seaeagleengland@forestryengland.uk. And I'll leave it at that.
Steve, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. Very cruel to have put on a map showing the eagle flying over Chris Packham's house 5 times last week. He still hasn't seen one. Sorry about that, Chris. But go outside and look up, I think is the answer.
Always
right.
look up.
Always look up. That's what David Lindo says. Right. I'm just going to ask a quick one myself, and that is that I'm fascinated by the way they are all individuals. You've got birds that are clearly kind of home bodies. You've got others that are globetrotters. What do you think it is that drives that within the bird?
It's a very good question, and I think that's a really astute observation, and it's one that certainly we've made as well, is that all these birds are so different. And I think G318 is one of the most extreme in that she's so sedentary in her behaviour and so patient. And then you compare her to G274, for instance, he doesn't stay in one place for very long. And I don't really know why some of these birds are so different. I guess maybe they get lucky and they try a strategy, and it's probably testament to the resource that's available here in England that so many different strategies can exist. Okay,
there's several questions about the tags. So quick description really of how these work. 2 things really. One is the downloading process for getting the data. I know you get it once a day, but you can presumably do it as much as you want. And secondly, if one was to fall off and you were able to locate it, would you be able to reuse the tag?
Well, yeah. So we can adjust the transmission. So to give you a sense of the scale of what we can do, I can get the tags to log points every 20 seconds if I want, which would be really a bit too much for me. And we can get it to transmit data every 10 minutes. So they are really, really powerful. But for ease of use and for conserving the battery life, we tend to keep it about once a day. But through the summer months, that being said, we do shift it to as many times as 4 or 5 times a day if we want.
And there was a question also about the one that just completely disappeared, which I believe was called Culver.
Yeah.
I know you don't know what the circumstances really were on that, but these don't malfunction very often, do they, these transmitters?
No, but equally they can malfunction, and one of the problems that could have happened with this bird is that he made an incredible journey over 6 days, as a lot of you will know. He flew over central London, and he engaged 15 million people in the space of an afternoon, which was fantastic. But equally, that probably exerted a lot of energy, and there's a good chance that what happened is he may have just died in the corner of a copse somewhere and hit the ground, and transmitters in the ground, and doesn't send any data. So it's difficult to say what could happen. There's all kinds of things that could have happened, and
sure, understood.
Unfortunately, we just don't know. We tried quite a lot of things to try and find them as well. So hopefully we're wrong and it's malfunctionally turns up one day. That'd be great.
So question about the collection process. Do you get attacked by the adult birds whilst you're doing the collection, or is it all very calm?
No, they don't get attacked as far as I know. I've not been up to do it because the first year I started, they were already collecting the birds and I entered my role. And then last year, of course, with COVID, I wasn't able to travel. So the guys in Scotland did everything and we did everything at this end. So they don't get attacked by whitetail. I know there's some osprey nests that attack you. So it might be that there's some white-tailed eagles that are a little bit more defensive, but as far as I understand it, adults just circle the nest. That's what they tend to do.
Okay, so could you describe a little bit more the hacking pen area? One of the questions that came in is, do you have to keep the sound down around that area, the human sounds, and also do they ever meet any people other than the vet that maybe gives them the sign-off before they're released?
Yeah, so it's really important that they're totally undisturbed. So what we're trying to do with the hacking cages is try and replicate a wild situation as best we can. Clearly plywood box and wire mesh cage isn't a natural nest, but we try not to have any outside influence. So the birds, other than the birds that are in the cage together, they can't see any of the other birds. They don't see us at any point ever, unless we're collecting them for tagging, and that's about all the human contact they get, actually. And then when we feed them, we're really very quiet. Nobody goes down to the hacking cages at all. So it's critical that they're not disturbed, really, to keep it wild.
We had some discussions earlier about lead shot. Are you finding any evidence of lead within any of the birds that have died?
Well, it is a good point. Lead is a cause for concern in some respects, and it is a leading cause of death in white-tailed eagles in other parts of Europe. But we can't say that there's lead impacts because we've not lost any birds to lead poisoning to date. That's but what we see as well, I think this is probably something I could have touched on a bit better, is that the older birds really prefer to catch their own food. They're not scavengers after they reach 2 years old. They're really primarily hunters, and what they really want, and we saw this throughout the year, G274 and G324, is that they want fish and they catch fish. Even in the middle of winter, they're catching fish. And this is something not a lot of people thought was going to happen. They didn't think fish was available throughout the winter months in southern England, but it is, and that's what they'll go for when they can get it.
Okay, can people actually, or groups of people, sponsor tags of future birds? I think the answer is probably yes, isn't it?
Well, that's probably a question for our partners, the Roy Dennis Wildlife Foundation, to be honest.
Okay, how high do they go when they're flying? I think it's quite high, isn't it, at times?
Yeah, the highest I've seen so far on the tracking data is 1.2 kilometers, which is Yeah, you wouldn't see that one.
So they haven't been to Wales yet, and not too many journeys down to the far southwest. What do you think's the reason for that? Because they seem to head north and east.
Yeah, well, we do get a lot. We have had a lot of journeys to the southwest this year. Actually, I didn't put all those maps up. Yeah, but if you go on some of the audience go on the Roy Dennis page, you'll find a few journeys to the southwest this year. 2020 birds. They tend to go with the wind. Yeah, that's. We haven't got any scientific evidence for that. That's just Tim and I's anecdotes, and I can feel Roy wondering whether we're right or not. But the winds are really quite important, we think, in dictating where the birds go. But oddly, they haven't gone to Wales, and I don't know if it's a toll bridge or what, but they're not gone there yet.
Okay, very precise question. The two that were over Hengistbury Head near Christchurch on Tuesday morning, which were they? Can you
They
remember?
were. Oh, well, I can show you. So the blue and the yellow lines are the two birds that ended up over Hengistbury Head. Those are G324 and G274. So that is the day that they saw, or the day after they saw G318 off the island.
Right. There's a question about whether they swim or not. I don't think it's sort of, they just grab, don't they? They don't go into the water like.
Swim. They can swim, Keith. They sort of raft stuff. It's quite incredible. I've seen them catch some quite big fish, and also if they catch geese, injured geese on the water, they're not, they can't really lift anything more than they weigh. So things that are kind of around their weight and a bit more are quite tough for them to lift. So they do end up like, breaststroking them to shore. So it's quite something to see, and they can't always get it out. There was a fish I saw them catch last week or week before, and they had to abandon it because they could not find a way out of the pond with it.
Okay, the bird that was in the New Forest in 2019 that was seen by quite a few people, you remember Ollie Frampton had a photo of it. I think you never actually managed to nail that down. You knew it had a ring on it, but you didn't know where it came from. Is that correct? Yeah,
that's the bird we suspect was probably from Sweden. Right. And the reason we suspect that is the type of ring that was used. It was only used by that Swedish group and possibly a group in Poland. And they abandoned it because they were very difficult to read. Okay, there are 3 questions left, and I'm just going to wrap them all up in one go because I don't want to run over time. So it's all about the future, really. There's a question about when they do nest, how many years from now, or what age will they nest? That's the first part. Second one is, when they nest, what do you predict? Do you think they're going to go onto sea cliffs on the Isle of Wight, or do you think they might travel into the New Forest and nest on pine trees and things like that? And when they do nest, what size is the breeding territory? You can take those 3 in one go. Well, I think there's a good chance we might see some first nesting behaviour this time next year. But if not, it will be the year after. Yeah, that's assuming the 2019 birds will survive to that point, because of course, they can still come to all kinds of things in that period. As to where they'll nest, I'm sure whatever I say, the birds will make a fool of me, so I'll be careful. But I think they'll choose a quiet copse somewhere. I hope it's the Isle of Wight from my own personal perspective, but it could be anywhere. And as to size of breeding territory, I think territories will be interesting in the first few years. And I think we're already kind of seeing that these 2 Isle of Wight birds perceive their territory to be a bit bigger than perhaps they need at the moment. So I think those territory sizes will change quite a lot over the next 3 to 4 years, but we'll have to see. Okay, so you don't think they're going to nest on Culver Cliff maybe first time? You think that might be? I think, well, it'd be lovely, wouldn't it? It'd be quite a romantic story. But I think there's plenty of quiet woods that they'll prefer over Culver Cliff. Well, Steve, thank you so much for that. It's been a fascinating talk. It's a great project. I think everybody, I wish we'd actually asked for a poll as to how many people had actually managed to see a white-tailed eagle. I've only managed to see one by going to where I knew it was. So there was a certain amount of luck involved. So if you haven't seen a white-tailed eagle yet,
don't worry, you are actually in the majority rather than the minority. So Steve, thanks so much for that talk. It's been really informative and answered loads of questions that people wanted to know. So
no, thank you.